All right, Redshift proxies. So each time you press render, Redshift converts your geometry to its own format for rendering, which can take a couple of seconds if your scene's quite light, or it can take quite a bit of time if your scene's quite heavy. So say you have a large piece of geometry. If you were to save that as a Redshift proxy, then Redshift isn't going to need to convert this every time. It will save the geometry and its shaders to disk once, and then it's just going to read that off the disk. So if you have a heavy scene that's taking a while to convert each time you fire off a render, proxies are great as it saves you lots of time. It essentially just loads the proxy straight to the renderer and bypasses all the conversion process. Now the other thing they're great at is if you have an animation, you can save your sequence of animation as a proxy files. Now at the moment it's not very easy for us to offset our animation within our scene for all our geometry along our branch. But if we were to save each flower's animation as its own proxy sequence, we could use an attribute on our geometry to index into the frame number of our cache. And we get a nice and clean way to sort of control the offset of our geometry as it grows onto our branch. And it's also going to be faster than if we were to convert all our geometries on the fly anyway. So this is what we're going to do now. We're going to take our 5 plant models, we're going to get rid of any spare attributes and groups that we don't need. We're going to add our motion blur and then save these out as proxies. So let's start with plant A, dive inside that. Let's come down to the end and just see what we have. So if we come to the bottom here, I'm going to middle mouse click and we can see we have curve U, P, UV, and ends. Ends is a point group. I'm going to delete the point group. UVs I'm not going to use in this course, so I'm going to get rid of that, but I am going to keep curve U. So let's start with our attribute delete here. Let's just use that to delete our UVs. Let's put down a group delete. And let's just get rid of all our groups. So that's cleaned that up a little bit now. Next, let's have a look at motion blur. So if I put down a trail sop, let's set this to compute velocity. And if I enable our velocity visualizer here, you can see we're getting nice velocity vectors that flow with our geometry. And this was the whole point of keeping a consistent point count throughout our animation. If we were to have a changing point count, let's say for example we remeshed at some point towards the end, let's put 0.02, you can see our point count changes now each frame, so it's actually impossible for the trail sop to calculate a proper velocity, so we would have unusable motion blur. But because we've set our point count to be consistent, we now have a nice motion blur we can use for this. It's also a nice way to check, just putting this on and checking this to make sure your velocity is working how you think it's going to work. Another thing we're going to add next is just a temporary material here. Now we do already have our material set on our render instances up here. I'm just going to delete that and we're going to set our materials internally. If I come to our material context, I'm just going to create a new placeholder material. Now by all means we could in fact use any of our materials so far and bake that into our Redshift proxy, but none of these yet are going to be our final material, so I'm going to override this at some point anyway. So for now I'm just going to create a very simple RS material builder. And I'm just going to make this bright red in color, maybe a little bit of roughness. Doesn't really matter. The point is it's just going to be something that's obviously wrong, and when I see this I'm going to know that I've still got to override this. So it's really just putting material on this for now. Let's just call this proxy export. Let's just copy that, Control C. Let's come back to our plant A. Let's put down a material sop. just going to Control V to paste that into the material slot there. That's going to create our shop material path primitive attribute there. So with these done, let's next put down our actual Redshift proxy output SOP. So we're going to type tab, type proxy, and you want this Redshift proxy output with a little red icon next to it. Let's connect that one up. Let's set our frame range to be full range. So we want to do all of our 150 frames we animated. Under Redshift, we're going to enable our motion blur. Let's also enable our mesh deformation and our instances and particle blur. I'm going to leave these at default. But one thing that's important to know is these settings here, like your frame duration and your shutter efficiency and your number of steps, these are going to be baked into the proxy at this point. Now, if you go to your out context here and you come to your Redshift ROP, it's going to be possible to enable or disable your motion blur, obviously, but you're not going to be able to change these values globally and have them affect the proxies. So you just need to be aware that when you are baking motion blur into your Redshift proxy, that this is what it's going to be. And if you do need to change it, you're going to need to rebake that proxy. Let's come to our archive. Let's call this actually plant A, so it's obvious. And we crashed. Does happen. Sorry about that. I've just rebuilt this scene back to where this was. So let's continue on now. So we've set our Redshift proxy output to be called plant A. Let's come to our archive. Let's just set our file name. I'm going to leave this at $hip. Let's put this in a folder called rs proxy / so that's a folder. I'm going to put $os. So that's going to be the name of our SOP here, so plant A. Let's just change file name to also be $os. So now we're naming our files based on the name here. If I middle mouse click, you can see it's now in the rs proxy folder, plant A, frame number.rs. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is leave all of these as they are, but I'm going to turn off this discard the not used attributes. So what happens with this, if it's enabled, is it's going to look at the material that's assigned to your geometry, and any attributes that aren't used in that material, it's going to delete. Now I'm going to override this shader later, and I am going to want to keep those attributes, so particularly our curve view attribute. So I'm going to turn this one off, and it's going to basically say that everything that's on our mesh is going to be saved to the proxy. And just to remind ourselves, let's put down a color. We can look at our curve view quickly just by doing ramp from attribute, curve view. You can see it's just a single float attribute that runs along the length of our flower. So that's going to be quite useful for our shading in our shaders and things like that. So with that done, let's come to our Redshift proxy output. Let's render to disk. It's going to take a few seconds to output. And when that's done, if we open this up, we can see on our HIP file, rs proxy, plant A, there's all our files for that. Cool, so that's the first one set up. Let's go on and do the rest of these now. So I'm going to go up here. I'm going to select a couple of these nodes that are going to be quite useful. We're going to reuse these. So I'm going to take our group delete, our material, and our trail. Let's grab our color as well for visualization. And let's grab our proxy output. So I'm going to grab all of those 5. Just hit Control C. I'm going to paste these into our other plants. So Control V. For some reason didn't pick up all of those. What do we miss? Grab that one and that one. Control C. Try again. Control V. Just disconnect that one for now. Okay, let's select all of these again. Control C. Now let's paste this into our other plants. Okay, let's go back to plant B and let's have a look at this one next. So, refresh that view. Not sure what's going on there. Seem to be having a few viewport refresh issues. There we go. Weird. Okay, so this is our plant. I believe I deleted all the attributes before, this attribute delete. And really what I want to do is keep a few of these. Just going to control middle mouse click, see what we have. I think I'm going to keep curve view and maybe our mask. I think the other ones we don't need for our shading. So let's not delete. In fact, let's just delete ones specifically. So we're going to delete color, N2, rest, source prim UV, which leaves us with curve view, mask and P. There's no groups on this one, so we don't need our group delete. We are going to use our material and our trail. So I'm going to get rid of group delete. Let's make some small space down at the bottom here. And let's attach our material and trail. With our trail, let's just enable our velocity display here, and we can see that we also get nice velocity vectors with this. So this should work very nicely for motion blur. Let's have a look at our color and just see what our attributes we have are. So we've got curve U, which runs through our entire mesh. And we also have a mask. Which is similar, but essentially it was the mask that controlled how this thing unfolded. I think probably I'm just going to keep the curve view for this one. I don't think we're going to need the mask particularly. Could be nice for having some animated attributes, but I think it's too close to be the same as curve view. So let's also just come up here and just delete mask as well. Now, while I look at this, one other thing I might change is I can see at the start, this is looking a little bit low polygon. I might just come back to our original sweep and just increase the subdivisions there. So if I come all the way back up to the top here, try and remember where we did this. We have our sweep here, and we had a resample before that. So we had done 50 segments here. Let's just increase that to 100. I think now this should give us some nicer resolution there, which it does. One other attribute I'd like to add is maybe just a random value for all of our spines here. Now, what we could do, we could create an attribute that is our point number, which is our points here. And this will get copied onto our actual geometry with a copy to points. So let's just try this a second. Let's put down a point wrangle. Let's create an attribute that we'll call maybe branch. So float attribute branch equals, let's use random. Let's just do attribute pt num. Let's just add a random number to this so it's not the same as all the other random pt nums. This is going to give us a random number on this essentially from 0 to 1. Now this branch is now getting copied onto our copy to points. So we now have a branch attribute as well. And if we were to come to our color and maybe set our attribute here to be branch, you can see we've now got this nice randomization. And this is something else we could perhaps use in our shader later on to sort of colorize things a bit more. So I'm going to leave this on as well. So with all that done, let's just grab our Redshift proxy output. Let's call this one plant B. Got to remember to rename it or it's going to write over the ones you've just done because we're naming our files based on this. And then let's just render this to disk. This one's a little bit slower. Just going to wait a little bit for this. Depending on your scene size and how much geometry you have, it can take a little bit longer to process. But I might just pause this and come back in a second. So that one took about 1.5 minutes to output. So depending on the amount of geometry you have, and this one was quite a heavy one, 185,000 polys per frame, it can take a little bit of time. So let's move on to plant C now. Jump back in here, come to the end. Not sure why I seem to be getting some weird issues with the viewport here. I think I might set our scene polygon limit back to about 100. Might be something to do with this. There we go. Okay, this was our grasses one. Attributes on this, we have currently curve U and N. Got some point groups, so I'm going to clear off some of this. In fact, I might keep the normals because I think I'd set them specifically here. So let's keep those ones on. And let's just delete our branch and hairs. So use our group delete to delete that. I'm going to add our material, which is just our proxy temp shader for now. I'm going to add our trail, which will calculate our motion blur. Again, we can check this just to see. And we have a nice motion blur that follows the geometry. That's perfect. Let's check our color and just see what our curve U gives us to see if that's useful. And I think, just try changing this. Yeah, that's quite cool. So this gives us an attribute that runs all the way along the length of our main stem and also our hairs. So we could also perhaps use this within our shader as well. I don't know yet, but it's nice to have this. Okay, so this one we're going to save as plant C. Connect that one up. All the settings can stay the same. I'm not going to save this one right now. I'm going to move on and I'll probably do these last few at the end. So let's go to plant D. Scene really doesn't like moving around for some reason. I think the viewport's perhaps stuck. I could kill and create a new one, but I kind of don't want to. Come on, Houdini. What are you doing? Strange. Anyway, so this one we have, let's have a look. We set up our inner mask earlier. Remember, that was just the gradient of the inside. We haven't got anything else, so this is quite an easy one. Let's just take a look at our color here. We're going to look at inner mask just to remind ourselves, and this is just a gradient that runs from the middle to the bottom. So we'll keep that for sure. We've already done a group delete, we've already done an attribute delete. Let's assign our material to this. Let's assign our trail. Let's just check our trails, and these of course look nice as well because we've got consistent point count. Let's attach our proxy output and let's call this one plant D. Onto plant E. And I'm going to restart Houdini after this because this is starting to drive me mad. I have no idea why I cannot keep moving in and out of the context without it changing. Let's just try show all objects, hide other objects. So strange. Okay, so this is the last plant here. We have got a curve U attribute in P. So again, our curve U is just going to be a value that runs along the length of our spline, or the length of our plant even, like so. So that's all cool, we'll use that one. We've got no groups on this, we don't need that. Let's attach our material as before. So we've got our material on this, and let's assign our trail. And again, let's just check our motion blur to make sure everything looks cool. And it's all flowing nicely with the geometry, no glitchiness, so that's perfect. In fact, one thing that is a bit weird I've just noticed is our stem is spinning around, and I think I realize what I've done here. I remember that down here I think I created a custom up based on our normal, and I didn't create it back at the start when we did our orient along curve. So let's actually just create an up here as well. This is an up on our original curve. So even though when we come down to this point, we're going to be re-overwriting our up with our normal and then generating our normal based on the cross product that we did back then, we still have a normal attribute here that will come down to our sweep. Now I think this is still going to spin potentially, which it does. So it's currently set to curve normal. So I'm going to change this just to be the x-axis. Now that's going to lock it along the x. So now we should have a non-spinning stem. This one works the same as before because we're just making our normal and up vector manually here. That's overwriting it. There we go. Cool. All right, so that's our last one. Let's call this plant E. Let's connect that one up, and then I'm just going to go through each of these and just render these out to disk. I'm going to come back in a second when that's all done. So I've saved off the rest of those proxy files now. A couple of them took a few minutes to save. It really depends on how much geometry we're saving. But if we now go to our RS proxy folder, you can see we have all our proxies there in folders from A to E. Now this is about a gigabyte's worth of data here, but we have got 150 geometry files for each plant, so it's not unexpected. So now we have these, we can actually use what's called the instance file to refer to our Redshift proxy path, and we can use that to load our geometry onto our points. So just as a quick overview, if we come to our setup now, at the moment our instances are coming from our copy to points, which is creating our packed geometry. Let's just connect this instead to our points themselves. So these points just have, go to the render camera, these points just have things like our p-scale, our CD, our orient, things like that. So it's got all the attributes we need to align our geometry. The only thing it's missing is the actual geometry. So rather than using copy to points, we can create what's called an instance file attribute. Just to demo this, I'm going to put down this with an attribute create. This is not how we're going to do it, but I just want to kind of show the concept first. So let's create a point attribute that's a string, and it's going to be called instance file. Let's go to let's take plant A. Let's come to our Redshift path. So we come to our Redshift proxy output. I'm going to middle mouse click on our file name here. I'm just going to copy and paste this entire path here. So Control C. Let's come back to our setup. Let's paste that into our string. So each point now has, let's type instance star. Each point has its instance file attribute, and this is just pointing to plant A at frame 90. Now instance file is going to be seen by Redshift. It's going to load in the Redshift proxy and it's going to render our geometry on this. So if we go back to our main setup now, our render instances are just points, there's nothing more there. But if we press render to render view, you can see now we are loading in plant A at frame 90 to all these points. Now obviously this is very simple, we need to set this up correctly so we have the proper range of our flowers over our geometry, but we're going to do that in the next few lessons. But already this is starting to work nicely, so we've now got our Redshift proxies being read in just to the points themselves.